What is going on with the pastors? Every time I look up, I always see a black pastor in the news for something. Now they have Jamal Bryant. What is going on with Jamal Bryant? I have no idea, but this video, it tells it all. This video is telling so many questions so many of you guys have about Jamal Bryant. Is he a really Christian? Is he a man to follow? Is he going to get arrested soon? Does Jamal Bryant have a lot of skeletons in his closets? What are the skeletons in his closet? In this video, he is going to get exposed. So I want you guys to sit back because how this video is crafted, I mean, it tells a lot of cracks in Jamal Bryant's story that he don't want you guys to know. But pretty much it is being exposed right in front of our faces. So I want you guys to like, share, and subscribe here. And let's react. And I want to know your thoughts. Put them down below.
All right. An Atlanta pastor who led a national boycott of Target is now reacting to the news of a leadership change at the company. Pastor Jamal Bryant of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church says he plans to keep on pushing for change.
There is a moment in every powerful person's story when the ground starts to shift under their feet. And for Pastor Jamal Bryant, that moment is happening right now, in public, for everyone to watch. He built an empire on confidence and on the promise that he speaks for the people. Lately, the people have started speaking back, and what they are saying about him is not kind at all. The boycott that slipped out of his hands. Let us begin with the most recent details, because this is the part that made even his most loyal supporters go quiet. In the early months of 2025, Bryant stood in his pulpit and called for a national boycott of the retail giant Target after the company quietly walked back its diversity commitments. For a long stretch, it looked like a genuine victory. Bryant told major outlets that Black Americans held $2 trillion in spending power, and he pointed to numbers showing that store traffic had slowed and that the company's market value had fallen by more than $12 billion. People rallied behind him because the cause felt right, and the early signs felt real. During that same stretch, Target's longtime chief executive announced he was stepping aside, and Bryant pointed to that departure as proof that the pressure was clearly working. He was suddenly the most visible face of Black economic protest anywhere in the country, quoted by newspapers and invited onto national news programs. For a moment, he looked like a man who had turned a sermon into a movement. Then came March of 2026. Standing at the National Press Club beside other well-known activists, Bryant announced that the long boycott was finally over and that the community had won most of what it had demanded. The trouble is that this was not really true in any meaningful way. Target had reversed none of its policy changes and had promised nothing genuinely new. The company had simply repeated an older pledge that it had already nearly finished anyway. The big announcement, when you looked closely, was built on almost nothing solid. What made the moment far worse is that the women who had actually built the grassroots boycott from the ground up had never agreed to end anything at all. One of those organizers, the civil rights attorney Nakima Levy Armstrong, held her own competing press conference and said the boycott was absolutely not over. She called Bryant's announcement a slap in the face to the women who had done the real work. That phrase stuck because it captured exactly how it looked to so many people watching. Within 2 short days, Bryant was back on his own podcast, apologizing, admitting that he had failed, and that he had been reading from a different sheet of music than the community. It was a fast apology, and it was a smooth one. And if you remember nothing else from this opening, remember how quickly he reached for it. That instinct to apologize on his own terms is something you are going to see again and again. Hold on to that apology, because the speed and the polish of it will matter a great deal later on. That stumble did not happen in isolation. It landed in the middle of a season where Bryant already looked like a man swinging at shadows. A dress, a sermon, and a stranger in the sanctuary. In December of 2025, his wife Carrie wore a black gown with sheer mesh panels to a charity ball, and the internet treated it like a national emergency. Instead of letting the noise fade out on its own, Bryant climbed into his pulpit on New Year's Eve and preached an entire sermon defending it. He told the congregation that he bought the dress, that he liked it, and that his wife was married to him and not to any of them. It was bold, and it was also revealing, because it showed a pastor who now spends his sermons answering his online critics instead of feeding his actual church. A respected bishop publicly called the gown inappropriate for the wife of a pastor, and the couple ended up sitting on a national daytime talk show, trying hard to steer the conversation back toward more serious issues. Then, January of 2026 brought something stranger still. A preacher drove all the way from Alabama, walked into the New Birth Sanctuary during a live service, and screamed that Bryant was a wicked man who would burn. Security took several long minutes to remove him while the entire congregation sat and watched. Bryant responded by publicly calling on the United States Attorney General to press federal charges, comparing the moment to the way authorities had treated a disruption at a white church. Here is what I keep coming back to, and I suspect you feel it too. A man who is truly at the top of his game does not need to fight a dress, a stranger, and a failed boycott all in the same handful of weeks. So the real question becomes how a preacher this gifted ended up cornered like this. To understand that, you have to go all the way back to where the confidence was first built. The preacher who was born into the pulpit. Jamal Bryant did not come into ministry by accident. He was practically raised inside of it. His father became a bishop. His grandfather was a bishop before him, and his mother was a respected minister and author in her own right. Preaching was the family business, and Jamal was the heir to it. What people tend to forget is that the heir was almost disqualified before he ever truly began. He was put out of 2 different high schools, he failed the 11th grade, and he was sent away to Liberia for a year before he returned and earned a basic equivalency diploma. From that low point, he worked his way into Morehouse College, then into divinity school, and then into a national youth leadership role with the civil rights movement, where he helped organize tens of thousands of young people across the world. In the year 2000, he launched his own church in Baltimore, with around 43 members meeting in a rented catering hall. Within only a few years, that church had grown past 10,000 people and became one of the fastest-growing congregations its denomination had ever produced. He built television and radio broadcasts, he opened a school, and he became a fixture of civic life in his city. Yet, even in those early glory years, critics were already raising a flag. They argued that Bryant preached a version of faith that promised personal wealth and personal blessing, while saying far less about the harder work of community. He pushed back on that label publicly, but it followed him anyway. This is the part of the story that quietly explains everything that follows. Bryant learned very early in life that he could fall hard and still rise anyway. He learned that charm, talent, and a microphone could rebuild almost anything he damaged. That lesson made him genuinely powerful, and that exact same lesson is what slowly made him reckless. When a person truly believes they can always recover, they begin to behave as though the rules were written only for everybody else. The first person to discover that hard truth was the woman who agreed to marry him. The marriage that set the pattern. In the year 2002, Bryant married a woman named Giselle, and together they had 3 daughters, including a set of twins. From the outside, it looked like the picture-perfect first family of a rising megachurch. The young pastor had a growing church, a beautiful family, and the kind of public image that made him look untouchable. From the inside, according to Giselle herself, it was something very different. By early 2008, both of them had filed for divorce, and it was finalized the following year. For years afterwards, Giselle told her side of the story on television and on the radio, and her words were always careful and always damaging. She said she had 2 babies and a toddler at home when she finally decided that she was not going to be disrespected any longer. So she packed up her children and left. She made one point again and again that matters enormously for this whole story. She said it did not feel like a single mistake on a single night. She said it felt like a lifestyle. That one word, lifestyle, is the key that unlocks the rest of this video. So keep it close. because everything that comes later only makes sense once you accept what she was really describing. Years later, she would build an entire television career partly on the public role of being the pastor's wronged former wife, and audiences clearly believed her version of events. That detail matters more than it seems, because it means the story was never quietly buried. It followed him into living rooms across the country for years. Now, notice what the church around him actually did when the marriage first collapsed. Officials in his denomination said they intended to look into his conduct, but in the end, they took no formal action at all, because they said that nobody had ever filed an official complaint. So the most powerful young preacher in the building walked through a painful and public divorce and faced almost no real consequence for it. He learned the lesson one more time. He could survive this, and he could keep his pulpit, and the crowd would still show up on Sunday. And honestly, that is the part that should worry anyone watching, because a man who never pays a price simply learns that there is no price to pay. And not long after, official court records would begin to show that the pattern Giselle had described was far more than just one woman's private opinion. The court papers he could not preach away. Here is where the story stops being a matter of one person's word and becomes a matter of public record, and that difference truly matters. In the year 2015, a woman in California named LaToya Odom gave birth to a son, and she said that the father was Jamal Bryant. He did not simply deny it and walk away this time, because there was a paternity test, and that test showed a probability of fatherhood that was about as close to certain as science is able to measure. Odom said that Bryant had pressured her to end the pregnancy and that she had refused to do so. She said that he had agreed to pay monthly child support and that he had then fallen behind on it. The case moved through the court, and by late 2016, it was settled. Bryant was legally recognized as the father. Odom was granted custody of the child, and he was ordered to cover a legal bill of $13,500. Then it grew worse for him. In the summer of 2017, a judge in Maryland held Bryant in contempt of court because he had failed to secure the insurance the agreement had required, and he was ordered to pay thousands of dollars more simply to clear that contempt finding. A celebrated national preacher formally held in contempt by a court of law over the basic care of his own child. This was no longer whispered gossip being passed around online. This was paperwork with a judge's signature on it. And it is worth remembering that this was not even his first child born outside of marriage, since he had fathered a daughter years before he had ever met Giselle. When he finally addressed the public about the case, he said very little, explaining that his lawyers had told him he could not speak freely, but that nothing could stop him from talking to God. Yet, by the very next year, Bryant was not shrinking away from public life at all. He was about to step onto the single biggest stage of his entire career, taking the throne of a fallen bishop. In late 2018, Bryant was named the new senior pastor of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church near Atlanta, one of the most famous black megachurches in all of America. To take that role, he had to do something dramatic. He left the denomination that his entire family had served for generations and crossed over into a completely different tradition. That decision alone raised eyebrows across the church world, and leaders openly wondered out loud whether he was abandoning his roots. But the far bigger issue was the chair he was choosing to sit in. New Birth had been led for years by Bishop Eddie Long, a man whose final seasons were consumed by lawsuits accusing him of sexually coercing young men inside his own ministry. Those cases were settled quietly out of court, and the church lost more than half of its members in the painful fallout. So when Bryant accepted that position, thoughtful critics asked a deeply uncomfortable question. They asked whether the same culture that had once protected the previous leader was now quietly lifting up a man who carried his own long trail of allegations. Scholars publicly described what they were watching as a kind of church patriarchy that kept protecting powerful and charismatic men no matter what they did. Even the late bishop's own son, who had wanted that very job for himself, stood before the congregation and said that he had not chosen Jamal Bryant, but that he would still choose to forgive him and pray for him anyway. You could feel the discomfort in that room, and you can probably feel it now. Bryant walked directly into all of that tension and somehow managed to thrive regardless, because thriving in the wreckage left behind by scandal was genuinely the only move he had ever truly known. He took a wounded church, a doubting public, and a history that should have slowed him down, and he turned all of it into another stage. That is the moment you start to see exactly how the pattern worked. And then, carrying that same supreme confidence, he tried that exact move on his former wife, on national television, in front of millions of watching strangers. The confession as a comeback strategy. Around 2019, Bryant and Giselle began dating each other again, and the entire thing played out on reality television for audiences to follow week after week. It looked like a beautiful redemption story, the kind of second chance that makes people want to believe in love and forgiveness. It looked like a beautiful redemption story until a castmate named Monique Samuels stood at a reunion with a folder of receipts and accused Bryant of cheating his way through the relationship. Soon after that, a woman named Tonya Griffin came forward and said that she had been involved with Bryant for years, and she said that he had told her the on-screen romance with Giselle was simply being staged for the cameras. Bryant denied the worst of those accusations and sent legal letters, and the second relationship with Giselle quietly came to an end. When he later married his new wife, Carrie, observers immediately noticed how strongly she resembled Giselle, and they joked openly that the pastor clearly had a type. It was funny on the surface, but it also quietly reminded everyone that the same story kept repeating with new faces. Now watch very carefully what he did next, because this is the pattern that truly defines him. Just 2 days before that wedding in the year 2024, Bryant went on a podcast and said something that no scandal had ever managed to force out of him before. He said plainly that he was divorced because he cheated, and that he had broken his marriage covenant. Months later, on a different podcast, he went even further and said that narcissism was really just a fancy word for selfish, and that he had only ever asked what a situation would do for him. This was not the first time his own words had worked against him either. Years earlier, he had quoted a vulgar song lyric about disloyal women from his pulpit, and another old sermon claiming that Jesus had been wrong for most of his life resurfaced and drew heavy criticism. Even his money talk kept causing trouble, including a recent moment when he suggested that food donations could stand in for tithes and then had to walk it back once the clip spread. On the surface, the big confessions sound like genuine growth and healing, and maybe a part of you wants to give him that credit. But look closely at the timing of every single one. The confession always arrives at the precise moment he needs the public back on his side. He does not get caught and then confesses. He confesses on his own schedule, in his own carefully chosen words, framed as a personal testimony of victory. That is both the genius and the real danger of Jamal Bryant. He has turned the apology itself into a product that he can sell. The Target boycott apology was simply the newest version of a routine he has been running for 25 years. And that is exactly why things are not looking good for him now. The audience has finally started to notice the pattern underneath the polish, and a confession only works as a reset button for as long as people still actually believe that it is sincere. That is the story as the records themselves tell it, and now I genuinely want to hear directly from you. Do you believe Pastor Jamal Bryant can recover one more time, or has the audience finally stopped buying the comeback? Share your honest thoughts in the comments below, because this conversation truly belongs to all of us.